Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got a fascinating, although, well, quite brief document in front of us today. The SBTi Financial Institutions Near-Term Criteria.
Or FINT, yeah.
FINT, that's right. In this deep dive, it's really all about getting to grips with what these criteria actually are,
Right.
understanding the big why behind them, and, crucially, digging into the practical how. How can financial institutions genuinely use them? How do they set climate targets that actually line up with, well, the science?
And the context for this couldn't be more urgent, could it? I mean, the source itself kicks off by reminding us the climate crisis isn't some distant threat.
Now it's here.
It's here now. We're seeing it everywhere: record ocean temperatures, wildfires, flooding.
Yeah, the impacts are real. And they bring significant human and economic costs. It's not trivial.
Absolutely. And this is where financial institutions come in a really big way. They're kind of the gatekeepers of capital, aren't they? They really are. The decisions they make, about where money flows, that directly influences whether we're funding more emissions or actually speeding up climate solutions.
So the FINT criteria, basically, they offer a kind of roadmap for them to decarbonize not just their own operations, which is important, but their huge investment and lending portfolio.
Exactly. It's about aligning that massive flow of capital with the global goal, keeping warming below those catastrophic levels.
Think of it as the science being translated into, well, concrete instructions.
That's a good way to put it. The criteria tell institutions, based on what the science says we need to do, how much they need to cut emissions, and just as importantly, how quickly they need to get it done.
And who exactly are these criteria for? The source defines financial institution quite broadly here, right?
It does, yeah. Basically, anyone generating 5% or more of their revenue from investment, lending, or insurance activities. So you're talking
the usual suspect.
Pretty much. Your traditional banks, asset managers, PE firms, asset owners, insurance companies, mortgage REITs too.
Okay, so the core financial world.
Right. But it also encourages companies in other sectors, maybe a big corporation, with a significant treasury arm or financing unit.
Interesting.
To apply the FNI criteria specifically to those financial activities. Even if their main business isn't finance, it's about tackling those financial emissions wherever they pop up at scale.
Got it. So catch it wherever it happens. And the criteria aren't just about setting a target number and walking away.
No, definitely not. They provide guidance on actually targeting these specific investment and lending activities, tracking progress, and importantly, communicating it all transparently.
Right, the whole package.
Exactly. It's a structured step-by-step approach laid out in the document. Essentially, 7 key steps that a financial institution needs to follow to get aligned.
7 steps. Okay, sounds like a bit of a journey. Let's take the first one. Step 1.
Step 1 is foundational. Calculate emissions. It's that classic management idea, right? You can't manage what you don't measure.
Makes perfect sense. So this means they need to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions, covering all the necessary gases. And they follow standard protocols for this, like the GHG protocol.
Yes, exactly. The GHG protocol is the main one. And for financial institutions, a really significant piece of this calculation is their financed emissions.
Ah, yes, the big one.
The emissions associated with the companies and projects in their investment and lending portfolios. Now, the criteria acknowledge that getting perfect data on this, it's tough.
I bet.
Especially at the start. So they do allow for using estimates initially. But, and this is key, there's a clear expectation the data quality will improve over time. You can't stick with estimates forever.
That seems practical. Starting somewhere is better than being paralyzed by data gaps.
Oh.
Okay, so once they have that baseline calculation, maybe using some estimates, where do they go next?
Step 2 brings it closer to home. It focuses on their own operational footprint, setting Scope 1 and Scope 2 targets.
Right, their own direct stuff.
Exactly. Direct emissions from their buildings, vehicles, that sort of thing, that's Scope 1. And emissions from the energy they buy: electricity, heat, steam, that's Scope 2.
So the things they can control most directly, what are the rules here?
Well, for these, the criteria are quite specific. The targets have to cover a 5 to 10-year time frame. And they must align with the level of decarbonization needed globally to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. That's the key threshold.
Okay, ambitious. And I noticed there's something specific about renewable energy for Scope 2.
Yes, that's right. For Scope 2, they have a bit of flexibility. They can set ambitious renewable energy procurement targets instead of just, say, an intensity reduction target. As long as those procurement goals are consistent with what a 1.5 degree C scenario looks like for the power sector, just a different way to get to the same place.
Yeah.
Decarbonizing their energy use.
Okay, so scope 1 and 2 cover their own house, so to speak. Step 3 feels a bit different, requirement-wise.
It is. Step 3 is about Scope 3 emissions, other than those big financed emissions we talked about. So categories 1 through 14.
Which includes things like,
Oh, business travel, purchase goods and services, employee commuting, the indirect emissions from their value chain, but not their core lending and investment stuff.
and the source is clear here, setting targets for these categories is what? Recommended?
Recommended, yes.
Yeah.
Usually following the standard SBTi corporate criteria. But, and this is an important distinction, it's not required under the FINT framework specifically for financial institutions.
Okay, so focus on the big finance stuff first.
That seems to be the logic. However, there's a notable exception tucked in there.
Oh.
If an institution's emissions from their own buildings, which can sometimes fall into Scope 3 depending on how they own or lease them.
Right, complex accounting sometime.
Exactly. If those building emissions make up more than 20% of their total Scope 1, 2, and those other Scope 3 categories combined, 114, then they are required to set targets for those building emissions. And they have to follow the specific SBTi buildings criteria for that. So it seems that the criteria really want to make sure significant emission sources, even if technically Scope 3 for some FIs, don't get ignored.
That's an interesting carve-out. It forces attention on potentially large building footprints, even if the rest of that Scope 3 bucket isn't mandatory. Okay, now, step 4. This looks like the real core of the FINT criteria.
It absolutely is. Step 4 is setting those mandatory Scope 3 portfolio targets, category 15.
Mandatory, okay.
Like we said, this is mandatory because these are the huge, significant emissions tied up in their investments and lending. This is where FIs have their biggest climate impact.
Right. And what's the minimum coverage required here for these portfolio targets?
They have to cover at least 67% of what the criteria call their portfolio target boundary, or PTB.
PTB. Okay, and what's in that boundary?
It includes the emissions, or sometimes the financial activity metric, from both the required and optional asset classes listed in the criteria's Table 1. Though, they can make some specific justified exclusions for certain types of assets or activities.
Okay, so 67% of the relevant stuff. And just to be crystal clear, how do they calculate that 67%? Is it 67% of the emissions number or 67% of the dollar value? Or
That's a great question. It depends a bit on the asset class and the method they choose later on, but the boundary itself is typically defined by the total value or amount of the relevant financial activities.
Okay.
So the 67% coverage threshold, it's calculated based on the proportion of that total activity, that's the denominator, that is actually covered by the targets they set, that's the numerator.
Right.
It's basically about ensuring that the majority, at least 2/3 of their finance footprint or activity, is subject to a science-based target.
Okay, 67% of the total relevant financial activity needs target coverage. And wasn't there a specific 67% minimum just for corporate loans, too?
That's right, good catch. Within that overall 67% PTB coverage, they also have a separate additional requirement. They have to make sure that at least 67% of their corporate loan book specifically is covered by a target.
Why the extra focus there?
Well, it seems SBTi sees corporate loans as a particularly critical and perhaps more directly addressable asset class for driving change.
Okay, so you need to hit 67% overall across your relevant portfolio activities and make sure corporate loans hit that 67% minimum within that. That really underlines the importance placed on financed emissions from corporate lending.
It certainly does. Now, once they figure out what they need to cover, the criteria offer 4 different target setting methods they can use. These apply to different types of assets within that portfolio boundary.
Okay. This is where the HAG gets interesting. Strategic choices.
Exactly. 4 methods. First, you have the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA.
SDA.
This works well for sectors where there's pretty good data on activity and intensity. Think aviation, buildings, power generation, steel, those kinds of areas.
Okay.
Using SDA, institutions set physical intensity targets, like grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer for aviation or CO2 per ton of steel produced.
Right, getting emissions down per unit of actual activity.
Exactly. And these targets have to be aligned with a 1.5-degree C pathway over a 5 to 10-year time frame.
What's the main hurdle with SDA? Sounds quite direct.
The biggest challenge is usually the data. You need pretty granular, reliable activity and intensity data from the companies in your portfolio in those specific sectors.
Right.
It's great if you can get it because it links directly to physical emission reductions. Bidding that data consistently at scale, that can be tough.
Okay, high data needs for SDA. Got it. What's method number 2?
Method 2 is portfolio coverage. This one's more of an engagement strategy.
Engagement, how so?
The institution commits to getting its borrowers or investees, the companies it finances, to set their own validated science-based targets with SBTi.
So the FI's target is about getting others to set targets.
Precisely. The institution's target is then expressed as the percentage of their portfolio's financial activity, or maybe its emissions, that is covered by these third-party validated SBTi targets.
Interesting. And how does that work over time?
The goal is a linear increase in this coverage percentage, aiming for 100% coverage by 2040. The specific near-term targets they set are for a maximum of 5 years, showing clear progress towards that 2040 goal.
What's the challenge here? Seems less data-intensive, maybe.
Less direct data-intensive for the SEFI, perhaps, but the challenge is reliance. You're relying on your portfolio company's willingness and ability to actually set their own SBTs. It's an indirect approach to decarbonization, but it can be a really powerful lever for engagement, pushing the whole market.
That makes sense, using their influence. Okay, method 3.
Method 3 is temperature rating. This involves assessing the current temperature alignment of their portfolios.
Temperature alignment, like is this portfolio aligned with 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees?
Sort of, yeah. They use specific methodologies, often third-party tools, to calculate a score representing the portfolio's implied temperature rise. Then they set targets to improve that score over time.
Okay, and what's the goal?
The goal is a linear path to achieve specific portfolio temperature scores by 2040. Specifically, a 1.5 degree C alignment for the portfolio's Scope 1 and 2 emissions footprint, and a slightly less stringent 1.75 degrees C alignment when you factor in Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions.
So trying to steer the average climate footprint of their whole portfolio towards those global temperature goals. What's the tricky part here?
Well, the challenge with temperature rating methods can often be transparency and comparability. Different tools might use different underlying data and assumptions, leading to different scores.
Right.
But they give a useful high-level view, and it's often more feasible to apply across really diverse portfolios where maybe that granular SDA data isn't available or where direct engagement for portfolio coverage is difficult. Again, the targets are set for a maximum of 5 years, showing progress towards the 2030 temperature goals along the way.
Okay, so we have SDA for granular intensity, portfolio coverage for engagement, temperature rating for overall alignment score. What's the fourth and final method?
The fourth is very specific. Fossil fuel finance targets, or FFF.
Okay, sounds direct.
It is. This method applies specifically to financial exposure to the fossil fuel sector, and it's the most prescriptive of the 4.
How so?
It requires public disclosure of fossil fuel financing activities. It requires an immediate halt to new financing for fossil fuel expansion projects. That's a big one.
Wow, yeah.
It requires setting near-term absolute emission reduction targets for this part of the portfolio to really initiate a transition away from fossil fuels. And it requires a commitment to completely phase out financing for coal projects and companies.
That sounds like a much more direct intervention into, well, the highest emitting sector, a clear phase-out signal.
It absolutely is. It reflects the urgency scientists say is needed in phasing out fossil fuels. And the criteria note something important. If an institution uses this FFF method, its coverage rules kind of override the others for that segment. For example, it must cover all discretionary mandates related to fossil fuel financing, even if those mandates might fall into an asset class that's technically optional under the other methods. No wiggle room there.
Got it. So those are the 4 main strategic pathways for tackling those mandatory portfolio emissions. Now, the source also mentioned complexities for specific types of institutions or assets in the FAQs, right? Like asset management, wealth management, AIWM.
Yes, the AIWM section clarifies things. It basically applies when a financial institution is managing investment funds or accounts on behalf of third parties.
As opposed to investing their own money.
Exactly. That would be covered under their own asset owner targets. The criteria require these AIWM firms to define and disclose the types of mandates they offer. Are they discretionary, where the firm makes the decisions?
Right.
Or advisory, where they just recommend? Or execution only, where they just carry out instructions?
And why does that matter?
Because their level of influence, and therefore their ability to actually set and meet targets, varies hugely across those types. You can't really set a target for a portfolio where you're just the execution agent.
Makes sense. What about real estate? That's a massive asset class.
Yeah, it is. Commercial real estate that's owned or financed is generally covered under the main portfolio targets. You'd likely use the SDA method or maybe temperature rating.
Okay.
However, residential mortgages are listed as optional under these FI&T criteria. The document points towards the separate SBTi buildings criteria, FAQs, for more detailed guidance on navigating all the complexities of real estate.
Okay, so commercial, yes. Residential, maybe not required here. And private equity firms, they seem to have their own specific things to consider.
They do. PE firms need to look at both these FINT criteria and some dedicated private equity sector guidance from SBTi. Crucially, for FINT, their targets typically apply to portfolio companies where the PE firm has significant influence.
Which means,
Usually defined as having both at least a 25% shareholding and board-level representation. The idea is focusing where they can actually drive change within the company.
right, makes sense. And I saw the criteria break down different ways PE firms might hold equity. Gets complicated.
It does. The FINT criteria recognize sort of three sub-asset classes for equity holdings. There's common and preferred stock that includes direct PE investments and co-investments.
Okay.
Then there are investments via funds, where the PE firm invests in funds managed by other firms.
Right.
And then investments via fund-of-funds, where they invest in funds that invest in other funds.
Layers upon layers.
Exactly. And the targets apply differently across these, well, again, based on the level of control or influence the PE firm actually has. Direct investments versus fund investments are treated differently.
Okay, so step 4 is clearly the most detailed, the real engine room, covering those core financed emissions with various methods and specific rules. Phew. So once they've wrestled with all that and set these complex targets, what's next? Step 5.
Step 5 is about developing the public target language. How are they going to talk about this? The criteria actually provide a template for this.
Oh, helpful. Standardizes it a bit.
Yeah, ensures some consistency in how institutions communicate their commitments.
And what absolutely must be included in that public statement.
They have to disclose the percentage of their relevant financial activities broken down by required, optional, and even out-of-scope activities that are actually covered by their Scope 3 portfolio targets. Transparency is key.
Okay.
And critically, they also need to provide a brief public action plan, basically outlining how they intend to achieve these targets.
Right, not just the what, but the how.
Exactly. It's not enough to just state the target. They have to start explaining the strategy behind it.
And this language, this draft, it has to be checked by SBTi before they can go public with it.
That's correct. It gets agreed upon with SBTi first. It ensures the language accurately reflects the targets that SBTi has validated or is about to validate.
Okay, which brings us nicely to step 6.
Step 6 is the formal submission for validation. Once they've done the calculations, chosen methods, set targets, drafted the language, the whole package goes to SBTi services.
For the official stamp of approval.
Essentially, yes. For validation against all the detailed criteria we've been discussing, it sounds like a pretty rigorous review process.
I imagine so. And finally, step 7. What happens after validation?
Step 7 is about the ongoing commitment. Once validated, they have to publish their targets within 6 months. That's requirement 1.
Get it out there.
Then, crucially, they have to consistently track and report their progress towards those targets. Show year-on-year movement, demonstrate they're actually working towards them.
And these aren't set it and forget it targets, right? You can't just publish and be done.
Absolutely not. The criteria require institutions to review their targets every 5 years and recalculate them if necessary.
Why recalculate?
Well, to ensure they remain aligned with the latest climate science, which evolves, and also to reflect any significant changes in their own business or, the composition of their portfolios. Things change.
Okay, so looking back across these 7 steps, the FINT criteria provide a really specific science-based pathway, don't they? It feels like it's about taking that huge global climate challenge and translating it into concrete, actionable steps for financial institutions, getting them to align those massive capital flows.
That's exactly it. It's a framework designed to guide the financial sector, to help them actively contribute to decarbonization by redirecting capital, by influencing the real economy through their lending and investments.
And the source makes the point that this isn't just about ticking a box or compliance, is it? By adopting these science-based targets, institutions are also, managing their own risks.
Definitely. They're proactively addressing climate-related risk within their own portfolios, which should, in theory, strengthen their long-term resilience and competitiveness in a world that's rapidly changing because of climate change.
What's really striking, though, is how the criteria give us what the targets and the how quickly, the timelines, and even some of the how with those 4 methods.
Right.
But the real engine of transformation, The thing that actually turns these validated targets on paper into real-world emissions, cuts across potentially trillions in assets.
Yeah.
That seems to lie entirely in those action plans from Step 5 and the consistent tracking and reporting in Step 7.
That's a great point. The implementation is everything.
Which really makes you wonder, given the sheer scale and complexity of global financial portfolios, what does that implementation challenge truly look like on the ground? Translating these high-level targets and methods into tangible action across thousands upon thousands of individual loans and investments, the scale of that task must be immense.